But yeah, we when we have often we have new faculty, we just like to run brief Q&As with them, just to familiarize our students and prospective students with their work and what they're about. And in your case, you've been at USC for how long now?
This is my 6th year.
Okay, all right, and you're starting your appointment with Annenberg. If you could just sort of briefly go over, just give a broad outline of your research work and the topics that you're particularly interested in, and then um, why, given what you've worked on to this point, um, why the your current appointment with Annenberg, how your current appointment with Annenberg fits into that.
Yeah. So I am a computer scientist by training. I have been fascinated with um, computer science and information technology ever since I have a memory of that. I was lucky enough to have a very, very early exposure um, to computers and technology ever since I was a very, very young child. And I'm talking about, the late 80s. So that was before most people were really into that. I was as well an early adopter of sort of the internet, as well as always sort of like attracted by anything that revolves around emerging technologies, as well as gaming, as it is very common, when you are a teenager today, but not so maybe common, maybe 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So throughout my life, I really experienced firsthand both the type of opportunities that studying um, this broad area of computing, the type of opportunities that opens up to, but also the challenges that sort of this constantly evolving world, oftentimes at incredibly high pace, poses on society and on ourselves. And as I grew into a researcher, really a person that was interested in understanding how things work, not only artifacts, not only computer systems, but also the humans and how we enjoy these technologies, how we use these technologies, how do the technologies connect us and affect the very fabric of society. Um, my research agenda sort of shaped around understanding the networks that emerge thanks to information technologies and then um, thanks to social media and so on. So really, as a researcher myself, I think on my trajectory as something that started approximately 15 years ago or so, when I, began my graduate studies, and I became interested into uh, understanding this intersection between computing and society, between networks and society. Um, so originally, my research, at least for the first couple of years, was really into online games. My master degree dissertation was, in fact, about studying by building an online game, and this game was a simulation game about. Uh, Essentially similar to the famous SimCity
Mhm.
game, where you play the role of a mayor of a city or virtual city, and you build it. With the difference that the game that I designed was an online game, collaborative, where people came together and built their own cities, each one being the mayor of their own cities, and then they interacted with each other. They established collaborations or cooperations among cities. They established sort of like contracts. So they established commercial routes and so on. And the game that it in itself took almost 2 years of development single-handedly by myself as a, as a graduate student, ultimately became quite successful in Italy. The game was in Italian, so it had a sort of natural bandwidth limitation. Only people back then, were Italian players would play, but ultimately at the apex of its success had something like 15,000 users, 15,000 players. So this generated sort of like an immense amount of data for me to study, and I became fascinated by not only the really infrastructural challenges and the coding challenges and programming challenges of how to really build such a infrastructure and such a system and how to make it run with, players and so on, but really looking at the behavior of people online. And a lot of the things that I started thinking about back then, 15 years ago, when this game kind of came about, were also related to the behavior of individuals in these artificial networks. And again, we're talking about 2006, 2007. This was when platforms that were popular then were things like MySpace and Second Life, things that people don't even know existed. If you talk to them these days, 15 years down the road. Facebook was still a platform with probably 1 or 200 million users, which was obviously very large, but not as prevalent as today with 2 billion plus users. Platforms like Twitter didn't even exist yet, or they were just coming about, right? So I experienced firsthand that I had a minor role into sort of development of these communities online. And that motivated and fueled a lot of my own research questions revolving around how do people use them? How do this platform change social connectivity? And, I was embedded in this world and ultimately noticed that it doesn't only come with pros, it doesn't only come with perks and good things, it also brings problems, it also causes troubles, it also affects society in a negative way. So in the early 2010s, social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, etc., were praised and welcomed by the research community and the world, humanity at large, in some sense, as almost like these entities that bring freedom and unbound positive experiences and opportunities. Things like the Arab Springs back in 2009, 10, 11 occurred that were associated or attributed in part to this effect of bringers of democracy in some sense that was attributed to social media platforms. So there was an overwhelmingly positive perception, public perception of these tools that were now connecting millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, giving individuals who didn't have a voice the chance to connect, the chance to speak out, the chance to freely inform others about problems that would otherwise go unnoticed, right? However, there was little emphasis, if anything at all, about potential issues, about potential problems caused by these, and in general about ways that anyone with some nefarious or malicious intentions could pervert these platforms, could abuse these platforms to their own interests, right?
So and just to pause on that for just a second, what were the early indications that you saw either just in your daily life or in your research that potential, not just that the potential existed for these platforms to be manipulated, for people to be manipulated through these platforms, but that it was actually taking place?
Yeah, great question. So I think that probably the first couple of pieces of evidence came about from a variety of different disparate, seemingly unconnected dimensions. So one thing that occurred to me was that, for example, when you talk about vaccines and anti-vaccination movements in the early 2010s, once again, there were platforms where, quote unquote, concerned moms would gather discussion fora online and the like that would coalesce around, people who have fears or concerns that, for example, vaccines cause harm to children and so on. But these were back then, and to these days, to a large extent, still relatively niche communities, very small. The users who participated in these web blogs and so on had fringe views, most often, if not always, uncorroborated by any scientific evidence or based on fraudulent evidence and so on. But they were relatively small groups, with maybe hundreds. Sometimes the most popular might have had, a few thousand members who were actively engaged, and you would, attribute their interest in these issues as problematic, but certainly not endemic, certainly not kind of like naturally embedded and salient and prevalent in a large social network. I turned my eyes to larger social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, only to observe and ultimately get scared or concerned and worried about the fact that now these ideas turned from fringe to really becoming mainstream with millions of engagements and hundreds now or of thousands or even millions of users who got involved into these discussions on platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And not only that, but also in parallel, the worsening situation when it comes to really vaccine-related epidemics that occurred, for example, in California in the early 2000s, between 2012, 13, 14, where the rate of vaccinations for diseases that were considered to be in essence disappeared. Things like measles and so on now went up to really dramatic rates in some areas, for example, in California. So it was not only anymore observing a small fringe community talking about things that were completely frivolous, but now almost becoming a mainstream belief shared by now a sizable fraction of the population. And when that happens, obviously that has implications on the real world. So that was one dimension, but as I said, the observations came from multiple apparently disparate dimensions. The second dimension here obviously was politics. I was starting to observe reports from investigative reporters, journalists, and so on, that political campaigns were carried out sometimes by unknown or actors or shady organizations or unattributed to any individuals or party and whatnot, that really seemed to trying to interfere with the mainstream political narratives that official campaigns and political candidates or politicians would push. So, in the early 2000s, maybe 2010 to 2012 or so, there were already initial reports of social media platforms like Twitter and other online services like Google Ads and so on being attacked, being really targeted by unknown entities to distort political discussion in the United States and abroad.
Well, I remember just as one example I remember was at one point during the civil war in Syria, there were attacks from the Syrian, like hacking instances.
I was going to get to that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I was going to get to that. So this was in politics.
right.
And related to that, there was the sort of economy and the stock market manipulation as well that was carried out using trying to trick automated trading algorithms to believe that certain events occurred in the real world that didn't. For example, as you were correctly pointing out, I believe in 2013 or so, the Syrian Electronic Army hacked into the Associated Press Twitter account, and they posted that there was an explosion at the White House and President Obama was harmed. And subsequent to that, there was a flash crash on the stock market. So hundreds of billions of dollars vanished because of one fake tweet, right? Similarly to that, the subsequent manipulations of stock market using things like bots. In 2012 or 13, I believe, a company created a buzz around a product, kind of a wonder product that they were about to release. And this buzz was picked up by Wall Street, and the stocks for this particular company, which was traded on the penny stock market, went up, 100-fold or so, from 20 cents per stock to $25 and plus. So this was another enormous stock market fraud that was perpetrated using Twitter bots to create this artificial buzz that was unsubstantiated, right? So these were events in the space of economic area. And then finally, maybe most importantly, the last dimension where I was seeing concerning things was the space of extremism. So around the time when ISIS and ISIL became more growing and more prevalent, we started to observe how social media platforms were used for as a radicalization tool to extremize users, to recruit Westerners, or to spread sort of messages and narratives that were more familiar or more friendly to the hash and whatever the ISIS in ISIS support. And then occasionally there has been obviously many crises, emergencies, disasters, especially over the last decade, sometimes related to climate change, things like tsunami in Fukushima, nuclear reactor explosion, a meltdown, in some cases hurricanes, and things like Sandy, or later on other major Maria, other major disasters that hit the U.S. territories or United States at large. And in the context of these particular events, we saw how social media caused chaos and confusion and conflict, and contributed to the spread of rumors and misinformation and so on. That was true as well. In the case of pandemics, the first time that I actually got to study this was in 2014, when Ebola seemed to be a very serious risk for the United States. There were 3 cases that ultimately ended up on U.S. soil, 2 in Dallas, I believe, and 1 in Miami, if my memory serves. And back then, I was tracking these events and trying to understand how social media rumors and misinformation were harming public discourse about this event. And it didn't obviously limit to itself, because now these days, for the last 6, 9 months, 10 months, we have been living through the biggest pandemic of the century. And with COVID-19, we have seen and we keep seeing the same problems over and over that we already had uncovered with the Ebola epidemic of 2014. So how social media gets distorted in the case of public health crisis. So as you see, there are
just to interject here. So you've brought, going back to Ebola, you've brought the timeline of the events right up to the 2016 election. So it seems like a natural time to discuss that. So how did you see phenomena like bots, the phenomena like international actors, all of those strands seem to come together, right, around the 2016 election?
Yeah, I think that was probably the pivotal moment for my research career, at least as an early career researcher. And maybe it was the pivotal moment for the entire research, academic discipline of computational social science up until to that point. As I said, there were all these seemingly disparate or unrelated parts of the story coming together. And then in 2016, with the election, everything culminated into kind of a big picture that came together as a sort of like finalizing or completing the puzzle. So I give you a little bit of my personal perspective. I argue that I played a bit of a role, maybe prominent, but certainly I contributed to some of this unveiling of some of these problems back then. Everything started around 2015, actually, when I had just joined the USC, in summer 2015. And I was sort of like starting my research group here, and I was starting to define, sort of like formalize these research questions to look into social media and possible manipulation and abuse of social media for nefarious, malicious purposes. Now, to that point, again, late 2015, I had worked already for nearly half a decade, for 4 years plus, on the machine learning and computational techniques to understand networks and manipulation of social networks. Interestingly enough, my original interest into developing computational tools to understand network manipulation didn't start with social media, but started with criminal networks, so networks of criminals. I was born and raised in Sicily, and so a problem dear to my heart was studying mafia syndicates and then criminal gangs and so on, and finding ways to track their activity and then dismantle them. So the original work that I had done in that space around 2010 to 2011 and so on was network techniques to identify these groups of malicious actors, in that case criminals, into these networks of communication. So communication networks like reconstructed from mobile phones, interactions, from social media interactions, and so on. Then, as my attention shifted towards now social media manipulation, I realized that many of the techniques that we developed in the space of criminal network analysis now could be repurposed and further developed to identify these signatures of manipulations and detecting malicious actors online. So fast forward again 5 years, 6 years, now we are getting closer to the election. We had published a very large body of work that you can think of as a machine learning research in general, to study networks and network detecting, again, manipulation of networks. And because of all these pieces of the puzzle sort of coming together nicely, with all these different pieces of evidence and concerning things coming from all these different directions, I thought, what could be the most damaging, the most impactful type of manipulation that could occur if someone with malicious intentions wanted to make a very, very damaging operation, right? And obviously, my attention came about, ended up on the upcoming 2016 election. So there was already enough evidence because of Brexit that had occurred, or the Brexit vote that had occurred less than 1 year before, that there was a certain attention or a certain effort, a suspicious effort to disturb or perturbate or distort the social media discussion about these political events, in particular voting events, not just political discussion in general, but really votings. And since voting is the act that defines the democratic process, it is in itself maybe the most important defining thing that we can do collectively as a society to express our rights, right, and our beliefs, etc. Other researchers had published or posted findings in regard to Brexit, but it didn't seem like many people were paying attention to the 2016 elections as far as I was hearing in the research community, which was extremely puzzling. So I thought that there was something missing there, that people were not paying attention or enough attention to the issue that as it was warranted. So we set up sort of like a pilot research project, if you want, where we said we should track the discussion online, and we determined that we should go about and carry out a continuous data collection for several months. Starting sort of in the summer.
This is just to clarify. This is your research group at Viterbi. It's the what's the full formal name?
There is no formal name. My research.
Oh no, it's just it's your research group. Okay.
Yeah, there is a larger research group that involves other faculty, but I don't call my group like that because it's that is a larger group. Yeah, so it's you can call it Ferrara. I call it Ferrara's lab. So that it's really my research group. So we started, with this data collection around, right on the outset of the election, so in summer 2016, and tracking, political discussion online, mostly in English, but also in other languages, trying to understand what was going on there. And we ultimately applied the network analysis and machine learning tools that we had developed in the years before to understand if there was any evidence and signature of malicious activity or distortion of social media discussion. And my real goal there was to try to publish a peer-reviewed paper before the election occurred, which was a titanic effort. I think we lost sleep for maybe 2 months, really between September and October 2016. Working literally day and nights and weekends to understand what was going on. So ultimately, we managed to collect tens of millions, more than 40 million tweets related to the discussion. We managed to run.
Well, you must have had some strong early indications that you were going to get results.
For sure.
You thought it was worth that kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, throughout these periods, we had already published, in the year before that, articles that illustrated how, social media bots were embedded in certain discussions, but we didn't really have these overwhelming evidence that these particular type of attacks, this particular type of manipulation efforts could become so, in a sense, systematic. So there were use cases, there were anecdotes almost in some sense that we had published about, or particular instances, particular cases that we had published about and observed ever since back 2012, actually, looking at historical political events in the United States and as well as abroad. But really nothing overwhelmingly concerning even though there was enough to be concerned in general. So I think that really motivated our work to try to understand if something major, something serious was occurring behind the scenes that no one was paying attention to. And as the analysis started to sort of produce results, we obviously had reinforcing evidence that there were some suspicious activities possibly ongoing, which obviously motivated further investigation and this kind of non-stop work. So the reason why obviously the end goal here was to publish results before the election is because in a sense, everyone is good at doing post-mortem analysis after the facts once you know how things unfold. It's just a matter of doing the science. But before knowing how things unfold and before anyone else really has insights on the outcomes of this election, I think it demonstrates your good faith that the analysis that you carry out is indeed not affected by the outcomes of the events. Right. So we finalized this paper, first early version in beginning of October, where we already had numerous concerning results, and we submitted this to this journal first Monday. And this was not a random choice. It was a choice dictated by the fact that First Monday is the only, as far as I know, journal that publishes their issue systematically every first Monday of each month. And I had noted that the election that was going to occur, obviously, on a Tuesday, that was on November 8th. And the issue that was slated for publication was the day before, so November 7th. So I thought that this gives us an opportunity, if we can actually manage to get a peer review paper in that particular journal, to put out results with a public stamp of approval that these occurred and are actually, in fact, in good faith done before the election. We don't know who was going, we didn't know obviously who was going to win. So, it should demonstrate that our analysis is in fact non-partisan and non-political, right? So obviously we submitted these results. The editor kind of came back to us and say, hey, this is a big deal. So obviously, we have to make sure that we get all this corroborating evidence here. Here there are the reviewers, what they say, and so on. So again, we go back and forth with cycles of reviews, and ultimately we managed to get the paper accepted just at the end of October, if I remember correctly. And the editor was so troubled and positively impressed, but troubled from a scientific standpoint of these results, that he decided to actually push this for publication immediately into the November issue. So in fact, the day before the election, that's when the paper came out. And also back then, I also published this article on The Conversation, as you well, that was also kind of a parallel effort to further publicize to the or kind of promote to the public in simpler terms than a scientific paper what was going on. So in
simpler terms, what was going on? What were your conclusions?
Well, there was a lot of problematic activity going on. So I will summarize sort of the gist of this paper. I mean, the paper itself is 30 pages, but I think there were two very strong messages there. The first message was that we had isolated actually tens of thousands of accounts that were automated, and that without doubt we believed were contributing to sort of a distortion of a social media discussion. And the reason is that when you look at these automated accounts that we like to call bots or social bots, as in social media bots, we understand that they can contribute to the amplification of messages and stories, right? Because their automated nature and the mechanism at which they produce content in a scripted, automatic fashion, autonomous fashion, actually ended up amplifying certain messages. So we tried to understand how salient this issue was and what was the prevalence of these bots. And it turned out that, our estimate ultimately assessed that, something like 15% of the accounts engaged in the political discussion about the election were probably automated, contributing a few millions of tweets to this discussion that are otherwise not necessarily produced by human users. And in our case study for the paper itself, we studied, if I remember correctly, tens of thousands of these accounts. We couldn't, because of the time restraints, obviously, do an all-encompassing analysis of all the accounts that we observed engage with this discussion, because it would take simply too long, as computationally speaking, too long of a time. So we focused on a subset. And then ultimately what it turns out is that, maybe not so importantly from a perspective of what the accounts were doing, but how the humans were receiving them, how the humans were interacting with them. What we highlighted was the fact that human users were retweeting bot-generated content, almost at the exact same rate that they retweeted other human-generated content. In other words, if something was posted by a bot, it was equally probable, almost equally likely to be retweeted than if something was posted by a human user from other human users. So this, in my opinion, was extremely problematic, because it suggested first that human users were not particularly diligent when it came to resharing content on Twitter. So they reshared content independently or equivalently, whether it came from a bot or a human, without doing any kind of assessment there. And this might have contributed, in fact, to phenomena like the spread of false news or fake news, how many people call it, right? Simply because there was no kind of validation or assessment of the provenance, of the authority, of the trust of an information source. So this was the message, the main message of the paper. The second main message of the paper was that actually we have observed the presence of both bots supporting Trump, pushing the Trump campaign, and bots supporting Clinton. So there was a narrative, a spin on this story, not our finding, but the general manipulation of the election discussion, that said initially how these were efforts to support unilaterally Trump candidate, and this was not the case. This was already what we didn't illustrate, we didn't demonstrate that. Our paper, in fact, showed clearly that there were efforts on both sides. However, there was a difference, which was that the content that was posted by bots supporting Trump was significantly more positive, more enthusiastic than the rest of the tweets that we have observed, both the tweets posted by human users supporting Trump, as well as bot and human users supporting Clinton. So the only difference that we could observe was excessive positivity in support of Trump from the bots. But otherwise, there were these two factions playing both sides of the political spectrum. So this was the paper. Obviously, the paper had a very serious sort of resonance and implications and effects in what followed to be the investigations into the Russian interference, what turned out to be a Russian interference operation. So
did your paper go into where any of these bots originated from? Was any of that included in that particular research?
Absolutely not, and that's a great question, and that's actually a very common limitation of this type of studies. Since we do not have access to the digital footprints, things like the IP addresses that where connections originate from, we can't do this type of attribution or provenance in an unequivocal way.
Right.
So there was really not a obvious reference in our work to what turned out to be a Russian sponsored operation. However, the study
Right.
itself
Right. So
informed.
here, so that would be the kind of thing that an intelligence agency or law enforcement agency would have to get. But then they could look at they'd have the set of who all the bots were, and they could cross-reference that with what they were finding out through investigative techniques.
Absolutely, and this is the type of work, as you say, that agencies can do during the investigation in collaboration with social media providers such as Facebook and Twitter, because those providers are forced, in fact, by the law to track this information, this metadata and user metadata and connection, internet connection metadata and so on. So ultimately, what turned out to be a multi-year long investigation unveiled the signature of this foreign sponsor interference. Now, what is interesting to know at this stage is that, of course, our findings in this paper and following papers informed the investigations, and the investigation reports and documents many times point back to our results, and they illustrate how these results ultimately ended up being compatible and oftentimes identical in message and meaning with respect to the findings that were uncovered by the official investigation. So it turned out that more than 50,000 accounts that were automated, that were bots, according to our definition, were attributed to the Russian interference operation. It turned out that there were a few thousand accounts, 3,000 or so, that were attributed to Russian operatives, what we call trolls, Russian trolls from the IRA, the Internet Research Agency. And at the end of the day, I think our study really put sort of a set milestone in some sense when it comes to understanding the mechanisms behind these kind of malicious operations to distort and manipulate social media discussion around political events, election events, and so on. And then sort of set a blueprint for future analysis. We published numerous papers in the following years, not only investigating multiple facets of this 2016 Russian interference operation, trying to understand who engaged with them and why, what are sort of factors that play into the susceptibility of users to engage with this particular operation, interference operations. But we also looked at other political events where possible signature of distortion or abuse emerged in France in 2017 in the presidential election of May 2017, as well as the year later in Catalonia in regard to the Catalonia independence referendum, and in 2018 once again for the US midterm elections. We unveiled in different studies other problematic behaviors, and of course this leads into the 2020 election and the work that we are now finalizing, that you are well aware about.
Right.
This yesterday.
Can you? Yeah. So we had a meeting about that. If you could summarize that briefly, just for the purposes of this
absolutely.
Piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are about to publish once again in the journal First Monday a paper that is set to appear on November 1st, so a few days before the actual 2020 presidential election, a paper that portrays a number of different problematic findings with the 2020 election-related political discussion on social media, on Twitter specifically. The work that we just finalized really investigates these two prominent dimensions of social media manipulation. One being automation, the use of bots and other automation tools to amplify certain stories. And the other facet, the flip side, if you want, which is the distortion of narratives and distortion of messages as they occur on the social media platform. And we unveiled a number of different problematic facts. The first thing is that, of course, we still observe signature of automation, so evidence of adoption of bots to amplify certain stories. In particular, in this particular case, stories that are associated with conspiracy theories, most prominently QAnon and other another prominent and very salient conspiracy groups that happen to be very involved in political conversation, not only involved, but also very successful in such type of operations, because they accrue and attract a lot of attention. I happen to have heard about recent results from another group from a researcher whose name is Brian Weeks, is a professor from the University of Michigan, if I remember correctly, and he ran a survey just a few weeks ago that discovered that more than 25% of U.S. Respondents from a representative sample of the population believe that QAnon is likely to be a real thing as opposed to a conspiracy. So there is evidence of concerning responses from a significant fraction of U.S. individuals, and this is reflected, in fact, into the social media discussion that we are observing. So the second part of the study, in fact, illustrates and portrays the type of distortions that conspiracy groups like QAnon and the sympathizers to their messages are actually injecting into social media discussion revolving around the election. That, I think, is a good summary of the work.
Sure. So, given everything that you see about the online behavior and how there are concerted efforts to use this technology at scale to influence the discussion, to create certain desired outcomes on the part of whoever these actors are, what do you think would be good advice for first consumers of social media to be aware of these attempts to manipulate them and help to spot them? And second, that what government and industry can or should do to eliminate or at least mitigate these effects?
A great set of questions, and unfortunately, we have recommendations, but we don't always have bulletproof solutions to these problems, that they remain to be very active and salient problems to these days. So the first thing that comes to mind when we think about end users, people who adopt social media platforms, is to understand that the vast majority of misinformation, conspiracies, rumors, false news, and so on, they spread because of human users. They don't spread because of bots, because of trolls, and so on. Despite the fact that, of course, bots, trolls, and interference operations of all sorts can contribute to the amplification of these messages, ultimately, what really matters is what we as human users share. Because think about it, if all it happens online is that bots or trolls and so on talk about these things, retweet each other, etc., and it kind of falls into a vacuum where no one is listening, it wouldn't be that problematic, right? But this is not the case. The case is that a lot of disinformation and misinformation and disinformation is spread by users like you and me and all of us. So if we can mitigate this problem, if we can, for example, educate people to operate a better judgment when it comes to what they share and the type of initiatives and the type of strategies that we can use and employ before we share something online, before we rebroadcast something to our followers, or before we post something on our Facebook walls or news feeds, things could change. It could improve dramatically. So I think it is always important before sharing something online, if it's a piece of news or a link to a website or a blog post and whatnot, to assess the provenance of this information, the credibility and the authority of the information source. So if it is, a story that has been posted by a trusted, reputable news agency or news outlet, regardless of the political leaning and regardless of your own political beliefs. It could be the New York Times, it could be Fox News, it could be the CNN, it could be any moderate or neutral information outlet. These that are established news outlets, with a high probability, not always, of course, but with high probability will post stories that are validated and are accurate. And one can also get into this politically motivated debate of whether certain news outlets have some stakes or political interests into pushing certain narratives. It doesn't, it's not really the point of this discussion. The discussion is really to separate these type of more established news sources from things that can be in fact problematic, websites that are created with the sole purpose of spreading malicious information, fake news, and so on. We know from the operations, from the strategies and tactics employed by the Internet Research Agency and other fake news websites that they are created for all sorts of purposes. Some of them are created really for political reasons, to further divide and split us and create chaos and increase the level of anger and engagement into this political conflict. Some others are created just for economic reasons, for financial profit, because fake news websites turned out to be a really good and profitable business to run. So regardless of what is the motive behind the actors that try to distort this social media political discourse, we shouldn't fall for that. We should be more careful about it. When it comes to other entities such as social media service provider and the industry at large, and when it comes to the governments and possible regulations that could be taken into place, that is a bigger discussion that has a lot of facets. When it comes specifically to regulations, I think that our research has actually contributed positively to pushing forward the discussion in terms of regulations and laws that attempt to mitigate these problems. For example, on July 1st, 2019, a law in California became operational. This is called SB 1001, Senate Bill 1001, Bot Disclosure Act, which has been proposed by Senator Bob Hertzberg and ultimately approved, passed, and became again operational into California's law, that sets some limits and some constraints to what on how a bot can be used for political advertisement on social media platform. This is the first and possibly the only law that has been passed so far. However, Senator Dianne Feinstein has another proposal, which is called the 2019 or 2020 Bot Accountability Act, that has not been discussed yet on the Senate floor, on the U.S. Senate floor. But if so, it will be in the future. This could become the first federal law to regulate certain aspects of automation and limit the abuse of social media platforms in the context of political discussions. Now, social media platforms and service providers that operate big companies like Facebook, Twitter, and the like, obviously are subject to these laws and regulations in the United States, in California, if they are based in California, as so it happens to be for some of these major companies. However, oftentimes they also have their own intrinsic interests and incentives to regulate and to monitor their platforms, because it is my firm belief that it is not really in their ultimate financial and otherwise interest to make the platforms into sort of a cesspool where everything is allowed and it becomes really kind of like the wild west of online behaviors where nothing is policed, or nothing is regulated, and everything is accepted. So many of these companies have invested a significant amount of money and efforts and time, and brilliant researchers and engineers and so on have been involved in deploying these different solutions that try to mitigate events that or the gravity of these events that we have been all become aware of, including the Russian sponsored operation and others that occurred later. Ultimately, my opinion is that this is an adversarial game. It's a cat and mouse game. There are entities and more of these entities as we speak every day that have interests into participating in what people in the government call information warfare, which is in essence what we've been talking about, the distortion of information online for the purpose of manipulation and maybe political gain or economic advantage and so on, right? And because, of course, social media platforms these days are by far and large the biggest playground for information warfare, they become automatically the most desirable targets for this type of operations. So unfortunately, social media companies have to, especially the large ones, have to face these attacks, and they need to be prepared to detect these attacks that are constantly evolving and continuously changing to escape the detection strategies that the companies put into place. So that's why I think that ultimately, as it happens to be, a joint effort between government, industry, social media service providers, as well as research academics groups like our own and many others, is really the only solution to overcome this type of problems, where there is ultimately not one single stakeholder that can single-handedly find and propose and implement a bulletproof solution that will forever address these problems. Because the problems will keep changing and keep evolving, and the eyes, continuous attention, and work of research community and practitioners alike is required to fight this. Yeah.
That sounds like a really good note to end on. I appreciate you making so much time. This is
Absolutely, my pleasure.